Well, thank you very much, Michael, for this introduction. And I mean, needless to say, you greatly exaggerated my position in the debates on cultural policy, but I'll just take it as a compliment and leave it at that for the moment. But thank you very much for having me here, and thank you as well to Anke Schad for this invitation. Yes. So, what I'd like to talk about today is what it means to talk about the periphery and what power has to do with it. Because as Michael has rightly introduced, I mean, we cannot really speak of a center without having a periphery. We cannot really speak of a periphery without a center. But there is a certain power relation between the two that but there's a certain relation of power between the two. And the question is really, how do we negotiate the transition from centers to peripheries and vice versa? Because it's something that has always been somewhat of a flexible, permeable border between what the center is and what the periphery is. Yet, it has become, in many cases, very strict. The center has become very delineated. You see it around the world where you start having gated communities in cities and so on. You have very strictly guarded borders of countries and regions. I mean, you can only think of the border between Mexico and the United States, the wall that is built in Israel. You have the very strict borders of the European Union. And that is actually something that is a physical delineation of that center to keep out the periphery, to really clearly demarcate the line between this is us in the center and all of you outside, you're the periphery, and don't even try to come in because we won't let you. And this is something that unfortunately keeps on happening and keeps on making victims. Because as you all know, this week yet another boat has sunk in the Mediterranean. And hundreds of people have died. And it's something that I just cannot really grasp. Because all those people, basically what they want is, they have been thinking of Europe as the center that they want to go to. And the only reason that they cannot get in is because we don't let them. We need to have an exterior boundary to what we perceive to be our center in order for there to be a periphery and for us to have that center as a kind of shared whole. And there is much talk about the fact that actually the way in which this is currently happening, the way we are keeping out people, is actually not because they shouldn't be here, not because they're not allowed, because actually we are legally and ethically, we are open to some extent to refugees. But we just make it absolutely impossible to actually for them to cross that boundary between what we created as the periphery of our center. And it's actually the mere use of words, the way we phrase things, that makes them into the periphery and makes it impossible for them to come to the center. And I just want to illustrate what it means to really speak of that European center. Because this is a map of Europe, but it's not a complete one, as you can see. Because obviously, I mean, you see immediately that there's this little black hole in the middle. Switzerland isn't part of it. Switzerland doesn't exist. Norway disappeared. I mean, the entire Balkans kind of disappeared. Now, this is a fairly recent map, because you have Croatia. But what happened to Bosnia and Herzegovina, to Serbia, to Albania, to Kosovo? What happened to the Ukraine? What happened to that little bit of Russia and the Baltics? All these parts that are geographically part of Europe have disappeared. We have eliminated their presence from what we perceive to be the center of Europe. And by doing that, we created a physical and discursive outer boundary that creates a huge periphery. Because I don't have to illustrate this, but you also see that Morocco is invisible, Tunisia is invisible, and on this map, they should be there. It's not like they don't fit on the map. The space on the map is physically there. So it's a real firm, active decision to take a map and get rid of these countries because they're not part of the center. They're the invisible periphery. And what I want to kind of interrogate is what the roles of cities are in that regard. Because it's very obvious that right now there isn't really much of a sense that we're actually a European nation. There are very few people who would actually buy into that idea. Even though there are European federalists, but even they would still argue that we're talking about Europe as unity in diversity. But in the process of becoming Europeans, as Monica Sassatelli argues it in her book, we created perhaps that invisible boundary by really focusing very, very strongly on what it is or what it means to be European. And in that process, one of the very key elements of that imaginary, of creating a sense of Europe, has been the European capitals of culture. So it's at the center of the creation of this peripheral the territorial boundary of the European Union is not a shared idea of a European territory, but is the shared idea of European cities. And these cities are spread around Europe, and you can see, and I admit that, this map contains slightly more countries than the previous one. I also have to admit this is a slightly older one, because Croatia isn't there yet. But you have Turkey that is part of the neighborhood of Europe. We call it the neighborhood, so it's kind of the friendly periphery, but it's still something that is outside of our center, because it's the neighborhood. You have Norway, Iceland there, but still, Morocco is absolutely absent, whereas that tiny Strait of Gibraltar is much slimmer than the channel between England and France. So there is no way that can justify the absence of a country like Morocco on a map like this. The question again, is Switzerland not European? And I know this is a very political map, but that's exactly what it is, and that's exactly what the problem is. It is through politics that we create this imaginary center, or imagined community, or whatever you want to call it, that excludes others. And we need to exclude others to become a center, or that's at least the very popular understanding, or the very common understanding of what it is to be a coherent whole, that you need the other to do that. But the question there is very much, what with the very porous historical boundaries? Because this little area here around Trakya, the kind of western part of Turkey, and everything going almost all the way up to Vienna, at some point was part of the Ottoman Empire, which created a kind of very porous and flexible boundary between Asia and Europe, which we now conveniently reduce to Istanbul as crossing the bridge across the Bosphorus, as transitioning from Asia to Europe. Whereas that border has never been really that firm, and there's always been a kind of traveling back and forth. Very much the same between Morocco and Spain. I mean, I don't have to recount the history of the presence of Muslims in Spain that created magnificent cities and buildings that are now really celebrated as part of our European heritage, as much as that may seem contradictory in relation to much of the political discourse of today. But of course, even though these cities, these European capitals of culture, have contributed to our shared understanding of what it is to be European, or what Europe is, I'm very well aware of the fact that in almost every country in Europe, there's a contestation of that very idea. I mean, the elections are coming up in Britain, and it's absolutely atrocious, the kind of talk about we're going to leave Europe, we want to kick out all foreigners, there is no need for free movement of EU citizens, we don't want them here, they're just taking our jobs. That whole kind of a discourse is basically in disagreement with this kind of a center. So I'm not saying that this is the only center that we have right now, But this is the center that we're, at least as a European Union, or the idea of a European Union, we're trying to make this become a center. And because this is such an artificial process of creating that political sphere, we are so much more firm on delineating the boundary with the periphery. And that is something that makes me wonder, are we really that central? And it's something, what I want to bring up here is actually a very interesting map. And I don't know if any one of you has seen this before, but this map was part of the Danish pavilion at the Architecture Biennale in Venice in 2012, where they actually had an exhibition called Possible Greenland. And the question was really, if Greenland, which is actually whiteland because it's mostly covered in snow for most of the year, if that snow is actually going to melt, because right now about 80% of the landmass is almost permanently covered in snow, and it's assumed that over the next few decades that percentage will reduce to 50, liberating an incredibly huge landmass about the size of, I don't know, say the Iberian Peninsula. So that's quite a lot of landmass that could actually become inhabitable to humans. And the question there is, when we're dealing with climate change, with rising sea levels, with forced migration due to changing environmental circumstances, maybe the center that we have in mind, whether it's around Brussels or whether it's around any other European capital, might actually become the periphery to regions like Greenland, where a lot of people might have to migrate to. But also, beyond that very thought experiment, this map really questions what it means to project a map, how you formulate visually what the world looks like. Because it's very uncommon to have such a peripheral area being centrally located on a map. And we've all seen the different examples. If you get a Chinese map, China is in the center. That's very obvious because, I mean, they are, after all, the Middle Kingdom. But it's something that a projection like this is just extremely uncommon. And moreover, it's even more uncommon that the center, which in this case would be the Danish colonizer, might actually consider moving to their colony. And of course, this is part of a long historical debate whether or not Greenland is still a colony or not, and then what you want to call it. I'm not going to go into those details. But it's still something that has rarely ever happened. In the early 19th century, in 1807, it did happen. Because Napoleon and his army were about to invade Lisbon, so the Portuguese court figured out, well, maybe it's time to leave. So they packed up their stuff and they moved to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And they spent 13 years with the entire Portuguese court in their colony, basically rendering their peripheral kind of land into the center of the Portuguese Empire. But that's a very rare occurrence. I mean, would you see something similar happening with London or Paris, moving their entire administration, their entire political apparatus to one of their colonies because there is a tension in Europe? If you look just 1 century later, you kind of see the inverse. You see that during the First World War, there was a very large influx of people from the colonies defending the metropoles as opposed to trying to get the metropoles out of Europe. So there's that constant struggle of what it means to be central and how you relate to what you perceive to be the periphery. And because this is quite a bit of a kind of post-colonial story because of the relation between Denmark and Greenland, it's also worth considering that we really see much of the world in that kind of very simplistic divide between the center and the periphery. And I will not bore you with the long history of the way we've called these two regions, but there is a very large overlap of developed and developing countries, of core and periphery. Indeed, as you referred to Emanuel Wallerstein, you also have well, obviously the colonies and the colonizers, and right now there is very much talk of the global south and the global north. But the question is really, what does that mean to have such a simplistic dual divide between that center and the periphery? Does that really hold up? And more so, considering the fact that we pay so much attention to what we call the global south right now, because there are significant countries are significantly taking their role both in the international economy or the global economy and in international relations and politics. If you see that it becomes quite difficult to push through something through the UN if Brazil or China or South Africa are against it, if India is not on board. All these things are of increasing importance, which was almost unthinkable just a few decades ago. So, if there are such regions within that so-called other peripheral global south, seen from our central global north perspective, if these countries there are emerging, does that really mean that this is just a completely useless kind of simplistic division, or does it mean that we create a whole range of new centers? And I guess it's probably both. Because right now you see, for example, in the BRICS countries, that because they're becoming so much more central, they are becoming their own center in a very significant way, it creates its own problems. I mean, Brazil, for example, has become a really important country within the region and within the world as a whole. But because of that tension, because of that pressure, and all that comes with it, there are also internal pressures. Right now, in the past few weeks, a largely white middle-class part of the Brazilian population has been protesting to get the President Dilma out of power because they want a military government, because it's better for them. And if you can compare the protests or the pictures of the protests of that with the protests that were happening a few years before, that were driven more by the working class, poorer Brazilians who were beaten up and chased out of the streets, the protests of the last few months, the protesters were taking selfies with the army, with the police forces, which create a really kind of shifting boundary also within the country of where the core of that power is shifting. And I can go on about this, but there is one element that I would also still like to mention, is that you see something rather similar in South Africa. Over the past few weeks, there have been atrocious slaughterings of foreigners, mainly people from elsewhere in Africa, because they are foreign. Because of the perceived success of South Africa, there's a rather large influx of migrants that has been going on for a few decades now, and they're increasingly met with xenophobic violence, and they're literally chased out. They're not even kindly asked to leave, as you have it in the very kind, and this is sarcasm, discourse of Nigel Farage in Britain, for example, who just kindly asks the foreigners not to come or to leave. But in South Africa, people are really being beaten up, slaughtered to death and burnt alive. This is something because they are not part of that perceived core. And that core is really establishing. So within that global south, does it make sense to speak of that core? Who has that power? Yet, when we speak of the rise of that global south, there is much of a sense that the south as a whole is rising, as that Human Development Report of 2013 would like us believe, that the south is rising, and that there is human progress in a diverse world. Yet, and at the same time, there is very much of a sense that the creative economy around the world is also very much part of that movement of the global south towards a more equitable, sharing of whatever is going on economically and politically. Yet, the question is really, is that really the South? And who in the South is really benefiting from that? What are the centers within that context? And first of all, that first answer is right. rather simple, because the south is a bit of a tricky concept, because that black line that I drew is the equator, and everything north of that is the north, and everything south of that is the south. And we often think that that equator is much higher than it is, because my fellow countryman Gerardus Mercator actually drew up this rather flattering map of the world back in 1569. And that is still the map that is most commonly used to represent the world. Whereas right now we should have the technology and the know-how to actually come up with a projection that is actually somewhat more, that does somewhat more justice to the actual sizes of countries and to the landmass and the balance between that. But again, if the South as a whole is on the rise, why would we have such a massive influx of people trying to look for another life somewhere else? If the South as a whole is rising, why are so many people migrating, be it to South Africa, trying to cross the Mediterranean, trying to cross the border between Mexico and the United States, and so on and so on? Does that mean that the South as a whole is rising? Or that there are little pockets of global South that create new centers, that there are new centers emerging that don't have really much to do with the tension between the North and the South, that are just emerging as cities? And that exactly is what I want to kind of get to towards the closing of this talk, is the importance of cities in our imaginary of what the world is becoming is absolutely crucial. Because if you look at this map, which indicates all the 69 UNESCO or cities that are part of the UNESCO Creative Cities Network, you see that we're talking about cities. And this is a very big shift away from the other big project of UNESCO, if you can say that focuses on World Heritage. World Heritage are small sites, remnants of a history of our joint humanity. But we're now talking more about cities. These cities are central to what we think the world is becoming. And in that regard, I find it absolutely striking that of these 69 cities, they're based in only 32 countries, and granted, this project has only been in the running for a bit over 10 years. But if you get 69 cities, why only in 32 countries? Why are the vast majority of them in Europe? Why are there so much in East Asia? And why are there only a few in, say, Africa and none in Central Asia? Why is that? Why do you have that? Why is there such a dispersion? And what does that mean for our changing image of where, globally speaking, the center is and where the periphery is? Is Europe still the center in this imaginary, with a few central cities around the world, or is that something that is just still very much in process and in progress? And am I just a bit too early to draw any conclusions from this project? And in order to end, I would actually just like to ask a few questions. Because starting from the idea that cultural policy is now increasingly urban rather than national, I really wonder, what are the boundaries of our public sphere or public spheres? Who do we share responsibilities with as a result of that? And who can join and how? Because if we're talking about cities as becoming central, then we don't have the territorial authority to include or exclude people, because that is still something that falls under the jurisdiction of countries. But if cities are more important in the way we perceive the development of regions in relation to their periphery, then I ask that question. What kind of solidarity are we talking about within these cities? And finally, the central question perhaps, will the center that we're creating, be it a city or be it Europe, will that be an island around which migrants from the periphery are left to drown? Or will it be a friendly harbor? And I don't really have an answer to this. I obviously hope for the latter, but I fear that it will be a combination of both. And that it very much depends on who you are, whether the center becomes a friendly harbor or whether it will be some place that just leaves you out to drown. And this is not something that is just existing, that is just out there, that we just have to accept. It is something that is continuously remade through the discourse we apply to thinking of center and periphery and the politics in which that results. So I would argue there is no center without a periphery and no periphery without a center. But it all comes down to power. Who can decide who gets to be part of this center, who will be left out in the periphery, and also importantly, what is the center? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christiaan, for your thoughts. You started with views on Europe and then gave us an idea of the tradition of wrong views on the world, maybe. When you talked about this creative cities catalogue, I felt reminded of a series of discussions organized by the European Cultural Foundation a few years ago. I think it was about the dawning of Europe, and there had been voices from India, from China, from Brazil and also Africa, saying this idea of Europe being a center is more or less gone. And instead of that, I see the biggest number of creative capitals still there. What about this contradiction that the view from outside of Europe might be quite different from that being an inside of Europe?
If you can hear me, I'll just speak without the thing. I think my...
Is it possible?
Can you hear me? Okay, no, that's fine, no worries. No, there is indeed a tension between the fact that, as the European Cultural Foundation, their project was called Dwarfing Europe, and indeed it became, in many ways, in terms of political significance, in terms of economic prowess, it has become a dwarf. It also reminds of the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty, who is speaking of the need to provincialize Europe, to don't really keep on seeing Europe as the center of the way we look at things, but to really see that Europe is just one region among many, which with its own particular features and so on. But it does indeed, I would argue, create a tension with that focus on this creative cities network. But of course, there's quite an extent. There might be a lot of kind of realpolitik playing in that the cities in Europe might just have more institutional capacity to actually focus on these things. There is also that tradition of focusing on European capitals for culture. So there is this whole mindset of thinking about putting in such bids and creating that kind of imaginary of one's own city. And I must say, I mean, my hometown, Ghent, is UNESCO City of Music. My current town, Edinburgh, is UNESCO City of Literature. But to be absolutely honest, these things are not really visible. So it's something that, I mean, I use this as a bit of a provocation, but one can also ask, what does it really mean to be part of that network? Does it have any significance at all? And I hope it would be. But then, if it has significance, that I would really like to see more cities from around the world being part of that network.
There might be also a question from the audience to start our conversation. Are there any immediate directions, please?
Thank you. My name is Veronika Lein. I'm working for the I'm working for the Network of European Cultural Journals, Eurozine. You might know that. We are just now working on preparing a conference on a very similar topic on center and periphery, and we are preparing this in cooperation with a partner journal in Slovenia, and inside Slovenia it's Maribor. So it's and they, our partners, very much consider themselves as periphery, very kind of somewhat in contrast to what you just told us. And I would be interested in if you could tell us something about how much people in their self-perception as periphery create this periphery, or also in their, I mean, Slovenia in its political actions within the EU, and I mean that's also on a cultural, political level. That's my question.
Well, I mean, in terms of exact numbers, I wouldn't be able to tell you, so I won't. But I think it's quite a crucial question. But yeah, I hope maybe if there's someone else who can give us any numbers on that. But what I would want to say, sorry.
No, it's not really about numbers. Sorry, it's about this this self-perception as coming from the periphery and not being kind of the lack of having the feeling I come from the periphery, so I'm actually peripheralizing myself even more because I act like that.
It is a kind of, I understood, a kind of self-stigmatization even, or is it something like to maintain his or her obstinacy to be against mainstream and say, okay, I want to find my position. Is it in the periphery, but it's my own?
Or are there actually possibilities? Is there actually potential in this position in the periphery? They are not really. That's my feeling. They're not really asking this question, rather the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, I think to some extent the periphery is a nice position of the underdog. You can kind of say, yeah, we are not the center, and because of that, we can do things differently. And I think that's something that definitely has potential. And yeah, I think that it can create some interesting dynamics as long as there's enough of a sense that kind of, and it may sound contradictory, but that the periphery becomes its own center, that it's not, that the relation, or that the identification of that periphery is not only in relation to the center, but that it also becomes a kind of, you might call it a satellite center, that is peripheral to the major center, but it is a center in its own right. That is, of course, kind of smaller. But of course, I mean, this very much ties in with the European Capitals of Culture, which initially celebrated the most central, the most culturally vital cities of Europe, and then went on to actually copy this urban redevelopment strategy to peripheral cities and regions that were actually suffering from economic depression and so on. So the aim, to some extent, was to create such smaller centers around that idea of the cultural capital, and that seems to really, inspire quite some people. So I think it can create something productive.
Any other?
What about maybe they just, all these UNESCO creative cities or creative cities of any kind, maybe the rest of the cities in the other parts of Earth don't fit the criteria that were set up from Europe, from the centers, as you say. I mean, maybe Gandhi is the capital of music, but capital of music is also Havana in Cuba or in Africa, but they didn't ever bother to go to such, to be defined as cultural cities or anything. Maybe this doesn't mean anything globally. Maybe it means something for people from Europe. I don't know, I'm just asking.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure to what extent that they wouldn't consider themselves as such, because I know that there is currently a movement, for example, across Africa that tries to create an African creative cities network that is kind of existing in parallel. And it's something that, I mean, you have this at many different levels. You also have the Islamic capital of culture, for example, which is something that, yeah, goes all the way throughout the Islamic world, which is something that, yeah, is kind of out of the imaginary of Europe. But I think there are many parallel networks that kind of exist in some sort of a hierarchy, perhaps. But I think it has much to do with the institutional capacity to actually put in a bid for that project and gather all the forces to actually make that happen. And I'm not saying that a city like Havana wouldn't have that, but they might not just see it as a major priority. But yeah, I think, I mean, to some extent it probably boils down much more to the ability of certain key people within cities to actually really carry such a project, rather than that city as an abstract concept not being central enough or not being interested in that idea of being a creative city. It's just a few people within the city who just have to make it happen. And I don't know, Pete might be able to do that.
If this sentence is true, no center without periphery and vice versa, at this stage, do you have any comments on what does that mean for cultural policy making? Is there something which is crucial in decision-making process? Is there something changing? What does it mean in terms of cultural policy?
I think first of all it means that cultural policy is itself peripheral, because the center of current public policy is economic policy. That is the center, that is the things. If the numbers don't work out, if we don't get economic growth, if we don't get our debt down, even though that never really works, then things are not fine. And that's the only thing that is really, that seems to be really crucial to governments. So cultural policy is first of all peripheral to pretty much any other area of public policy. And recognizing that and cherishing that idea of being peripheral might actually help transgressing it and seeing, okay, we are less important than economic policy, than health policy. We are not that absolutely central. But we have, cultural policy has the potential to come up with certain reflections on what it is to deal with that environment of a society. And that's why I was asking the questions of social justice, because cultural policy, to quite an extent, creates or helps maintaining a society. It it kind of helps defining the boundaries of what it is, what it means to be part of it. And that, in essence, kind of really maps onto other areas of public policy, because you cannot have economic policies if you don't know for whom you're making them. And cultural policies is quite essential in including people in that public sphere, I would argue.
So you would say this is the Maribor case. We should accept that we are on the periphery in dealing with cultural policy, and in that way against a certain mainly economically driven mainstream, and finding our place on the periphery.
Yes, I mean, and that's not, I'm not saying that cultural policy should downplay its possible role. But what I'm trying to say is that cultural policy shouldn't try to be central. It shouldn't try to be economic policy, because it's not. It's something very distinct. And if cultural policy tries to claim or make all its claims based on the output of the creative industries, then it's actually not doing anyone a favor. Because the only thing that's happening is that if then something goes bad economically in the sector, then that will actually reflect badly on them. So what I'm trying to say is cultural policy should embrace its peripherality to that economic policy in the center, but it should do so by really making, perhaps much like Maribor, creating a distinct identity of what it means to be in that exact location. And I think that questions about social justice, about inclusion, about the relation of us and the other are way more central to what cultural policy can engage with than the economic output of the cultural industries, just to reflect onto that economic policy.
Yeah,
I just want to add a little point to what you said on cultural policy. I think in relationship to cultural policy, I would remind of Franco Bianchini's concept, he has been to the conference last year, and he has developed a conference that is this cultural planning. I think you will know that. And I think in this concept there is a very good combination not only of cultural resources, and he proposes to combine different resources of urban planning, urban development, like urban development, architecture, and so on. And this is a concept of cultural, so it's under the heading of cultural policy, but it seeks to combine all these resources. And I think in this respect, cultural policy can be a useful tool for urban development, but not the only one.
Thank you. Well, what you described is a kind of double movement. On the one hand, ever more and more frontiers and boundaries are being put up in the form of walls, literally. But at the same time, you described the permeability, the fluidity, the flexibility of these boundaries at the same time. And what I'm asking myself is, from a rather methodological and political point of view, and I would say that this whole idea of a provincializing of Europe and a dwarfing of Europe is such a political or a methodological approach in order to shift viewpoints. And thinking about that, whether that dichotomy, thank you, dichotomy between center and periphery is still so useful. Whether we should think in maybe other images or possibilities which are a bit more transversal and more like connecting points, hubs. I don't know. I mean, the terminology and the vocabulary maybe still needs to be developed, but I'm very uncertain about the terminology, and especially from a political point of view, where it would take us if we still remain within this double structure.
I mean, yeah, it's quite essential to indeed rethink the way we describe things, because that really matters in the way we can understand them. And what I was trying to point at in a way is that we're kind of in a moment where we're kind of in between seeing things as very territorial, as the kind of legacy of nationalism that equated the territorial boundaries with that very nation, to a more kind of networked way of seeing the world in terms of hubs, where you have major world cities and smaller cities that are part of an interconnected network, and they act as hubs. And these hubs are actually, of course, still part of territorially defined countries, but they seem to be becoming much more important. And that's exactly why I was asking the question, because if you're dealing with a territorial understanding of a nation or of a community, you have the external boundary that defines where things stop. And it might be difficult to find the exact center of it. What is the capital? What is the most important city? Where is the center of that territory? That might be difficult. But if you take it the other way around, and you start from the center, and you say, this is the center, that hub that we're working with, then the question becomes, what is the territorial boundary of that? And that is, I think, the tension that exists very much right now, that it's a bit of both, that we were still defending very much territorial boundaries, and we're celebrating that kind of a network thing, but it's not really clear because the territorial boundaries, especially in Europe, that we're defending, don't map on to that connection of these different cities around the world. Because these cities, they don't really care that much about national or regional boundaries that much. And I think that's a very difficult political and theoretical question to resolve that might take us a bit longer than today. But I hope that we'll be able to contribute to that.
Any other remarks? If not, I would like to say, there is one.
Just a quick remark also just a remark on the comment we just had before. I'm wondering what the concept of regionalization plays within center and periphery, like connecting the two by creating regional cultural policies also within the context of the European Union, within and in the external cultural policies. So maybe you can remark on what role does the regionalization play within connecting the center and the periphery?
I deliberately avoided that subject because it's very political, and as a Belgian, it's even more political because I cannot speak of regionalization, especially in the context of Europe, without taking a political stance. But I acknowledge that it's something very important, and it's something that we'll somehow have to deal with, because whether it's Flanders trying to become somewhat independent, even though they're not really quite sure what they really want, at least that's what they say. With Scotland really trying to be independent, with Catalonia trying to do the same, and many other regions, you indeed have that sense that the nation is kind of, I don't know, might become less important. And maybe that is just something that might be part of that process of dealing with these hubs and actually saying, well, the boundary around the hub of Barcelona-Girona is actually Catalonia. The boundary around the hub of the Central Belt in Scotland might just be Hadrian's Wall. That might just be the case. I agree less so when it comes to Belgium, and that's why I'm a bit torn, because that's the whole kind of surreal element of Belgium, is that, I don't know, this is my political opinion, and that's less relevant. But that might, like that regional identity and regional cultural policy might be part of imagining the territorial boundaries related to these urban centers. That's just an idea, I don't know, really.
Yeah.
Just briefly, I'm an innovation historian, and what I say is about the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, what we can see from the history is that in the periphery regions, not only cultural innovations are coming from, but especially legal and even industrial innovations, and they're going hand in hand. For instance, the film industry was not really developed in Vienna first. It was in Linz and it was in Vojvodina in Serbia. These were the beginning of these innovations. And what I currently see is, especially in Eastern Europe, that those peripheral regions are completely fading away. If you don't have a tourist industry like in Austria, I can point you exactly, these are the small cities in Eastern Europe where they will completely close them down in 50 years. And this is the challenge, I believe, much more. Then we don't have to classify it anymore if there's no periphery anymore. So I would ask you simply, okay, in how far the centers can give some incentives to the periphery to survive. If there's no industry available there, I don't see any business opportunities or even cultural opportunities.
That's a tricky question, but indeed, I mean, if these smaller cities would disappear, then in that sense the periphery would disappear. But that would just create a kind of urban agglomeration that becomes then the periphery, which is something that, I mean, I think the worst case of that is probably Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, where they just created a city in the middle of nowhere. It was just, I mean, it's a city, there was nothing really there. So they designed an entire city, but because of the creation of that city, it attracted people from that wider region that settled around the city. But they're not really part of Brasilia, because Brasilia is a city-state within a state. And everyone living around it is actually living somewhere else. And that's what I'm trying to say with that is that there might be a risk of replicating such things when these smaller cities are actually completely getting empty and people migrating to bigger cities, that you'll create a kind of very vast, sprawling region around the city that might just not really include those who are technically living in that city or that feel that they live in the city, but they're not quite part of it. And London is probably one of the good examples of such a bad case right now, where the city is becoming so big that it's almost impossible to really live within that sphere and to really, yeah, become part of what London is or what the aspiration of living in London is for most who live in the periphery of the city. So I'm not quite sure what kind of incentives the centers could give to these peripheral cities. Yeah, apart from trying to decentralize things, which is something that has been attempted, but I'm not, yeah, the extent to which that's successful, yeah, is perhaps questionable.
Christiaan, thank you very much. I thought this will be a meta-analysis as a basis for our further discussion, but you came in already in very concrete examples, not only the Belgian case, and in our next round in the panel we'll hopefully see if this structure works for the presentation of Nigeria, Kazakhstan and Greece. But I think now you have earned a first break. But I would like to announce not only that Barbara Putzpleko is also with us, but she enabled us also to have a video performance outside of screening of Tanahang. It's a production of Hannibal Joseph and Yazak Kazeb from Iran, where they tried to make a political intervention with an artistic project combining music and dancing in the public space, and you are invited to have a look. We'll see us again at about 11. Thank you very much again.